Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Czech Embassy to an evening dedicated to Sokol movement, to a lecture about Sokol movement. Sokol, that is Foko in English, and the movement originally for physical exercise and gymnastics, established in the 19th century, but that also later on had patriotic and national emancipation meaning, and was also involved in resistance during 2 world wars. And well, it has its up and downs. It's not my job to talk about it, so it's my pleasure to welcome here first Jana Borešová from the BCSA and Mark Dimond, who is Rector from King's Lynn's Minster. And without further ado, I pass the floor to Jana.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone. Those of you who are here tonight with us and those who are viewing via Zoom. It is my very great pleasure to take part in this event today. First of all, I should like to thank Michal Strohal, who's Deputy Head of Mission here, for his help this evening, arranging everything so that we can all gather here, and also to the Embassy for so kindly hosting our events, without which we would be unable to hold them. So I'm delighted now to say that your contributions this evening in coming here are not for our profit. I would explain that all the proceeds are going to go towards helping some educational project in the Czech Republic. And we're very proud and pleased to be able to do that. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Dimond, who is a former history lecturer, and he will tell you, I did ask him to tell me secretly beforehand, but he wouldn't tell me, how he came to be involved with the Sokol movement and its ups and downs, as has been said. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I would just like to tell you a little about him. And he's the Reverend Canon Mark Dimond, and he's currently the Rector at King's Lynn Minster. He worked in Prague in the early 1990s and was Bailey's brand manager for the Czech and Slovak Republics. He has also completed a DPhil thesis on the history of the Sokol movement. So it would be very interesting to hear his perspective as a non-person, but as a welcome Czech person also, having lived in Czechoslovakia more than some of the Anglo-Czech people here in Britain. And he will tell you how he came to be involved. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jana. Thank you, Michael. Děkuji vám za pozvání do České velvyslanství. Tady jsem rád být tady. So I'm now going to talk about Sokol. Well, it's going to be a long story, but we'll try and do this in an hour with question and answers. I know that many of you know something about Sokol. You might be Sokol members. You might have family who have, over the generations, been part of Sokol because it's existed for 150 years. And also there are some here who have no idea what Sokol is, a few family members as well. So with that in mind, before I start the talk proper, I'm going to just show you a video of the 1948 sledge, just a few minutes, just to get you into the mood of really what we're talking about.
Je červenec roku 1948. Československo je už několik měsíců po komunistickém převratu. Závratným tempem jsou zaváděny nové zákony, desítky nejlepších lidí národa putují do vězení, stovky do emigrace, jejíž konec nikdo nedovede odhadnout. Praha, hlavní město, se přesto připravuje na všesokolský sled. Je 11. v pořadí. Nikdo z aktérů zatím netuší, že bude poslední. Ti, kteří se po dlouhém váhání rozhodnou sled konat, jsou dva. Je to jednak komunistická strana, která doufá, že se jí pod praporem podmaněného Sokola podaří ovládnout celou tělovýchovu, a jsou to Sokolové, kteří ač zdecimováni válkou a znechuceni nastupující totalitou chtějí demonstrovat svou ukázněnost. Jsou odhodláni svést poslední bitvu se samozvaným režimem a dát zaznít své úctě a lásce k člověku, který žije poslední dny svého života, odstoupivšímu prezidentu doktoru Edvardu Benešovi. I počasí jakoby se spiklo proti Sokolům. I ti nejmenší nastupují a cvičí v dešti a chladu. Cvičí a zatím nechápou, jak pohnutou dobu jejich otcové a mámy prožívají.
Začínáme. Jsme na ulici velkoměsta. Pozor, pozor, auto jede. Ať nás tady nezajede. Když přecházíš ulici, choď, jak chtějí strážníci. Tančí, k tomu bručí, medvíďata tančit učí. Táta tančí, hlavou kývá, maličký se na něj dívá.
To jsou starší žáci. Po těchto prázdninách už přejdou do takzvané jednotné školy a zahájí tak desítky let trvající úpadek školství v Československu.
I'll finish abruptly there because it goes on and on. But I think it just perhaps gives you a flavour of the scale of what we're talking about. Gymnastics, mass gymnastics. At its height, I guess, in 1948, when there were over 1 million people who'd signed up as members of the Sokol, which was quite incredible, really. So, well, why am I interested in Sokol? Where did it all begin? It was really by serendipity, actually. I had always a fascination for Eastern Europe when the wall came down, and I guess that there are many members here, the British Czech and Slovak Association, who either love one, a Czech, Czechia or Slovakia, or both together in some cases, and I'm one of them. I landed upon an opportunity to come to Prague in 1991, and it was a real opportunity. Wandering around Prague during 1991, it was April, and I just happened to be sort of taking in the monuments of the Prague scene and enjoying the wonderful beer, of course. And I came across this interesting building with a falcon on top, and I thought, well, what's this? So I went in and I saw that there was a door, and I went in and there was a museum. So I went into the museum, and there was someone there who said, well, look, it's only going to cost you a few pennies, a few haléře, if you like. So I went in, I was the only one there, and I was looking around the different displays, and there were objects like gymnastic uniforms, and all sorts of other things. And there was a point at which, halfway through my little tour of the museum, I leant on a glass cabinet, and the glass was paper thin, and I accidentally cracked it. And then the lady who was at the reception came running over and said, "Co děláte? What are you doing?" And I said, omlouvám se, I'm so sorry. And I think that did the trick. But of course, what I was leaning on were the medals of some Sokol Olympic champions from the 1930s and 40s. So it was a big false move, if you like. Anyway, I got over that, and I suppose I remember that, and really I've never looked back from that point. I somewhere along my very varied career, I've managed to have done a dissertation, a PhD on Sokol. So, the title of this talk is called The Rise and Fall and Rise of Sokol, as if it is to provoke debate. Falcon is what the Sokol means. Falcons rise and fall very quickly too, the fastest of all animals. In fact, Sokol arose and fell not once, not twice, but thrice. Okay, as Michael alluded to at the beginning, it fell in the First World War and in the Second World War, and of course during the Cold War. These were the times of resistance against Habsburg rule, under Nazi tyranny, and during communist oppression. The reality is that Sokol never really died. Even if in the homeland organization, with its center in Prague, it did temporarily during these times. In fact, while Sokol, with its center in Prague, did die a little, it didn't disappear abroad. In fact, in many ways, it got stronger. It was as if the falcon had migrated abroad to keep it going. Sokol was certainly alive in places like the Midwest cities of the United States, in Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Chicago, and also, not forgetting, here in Britain. Sokol was very much part of the scene here, and my friend Milan Kocorek has written about this, Dějiny Sokola Londýn, and they had their Sokol meetings to discuss their gymnastic exercises in various places, like the Coach and Horse pub, which is still there, but it's just got a sort of a new makeover, if you like. The idea of mass gymnastics did not take root everywhere. On close inspection, it actually took off in relatively few places, apart from the original German Turnverein in the Confederation of German States, and in Sweden with Lynn's gymnastic movement in the 19th century, as well as Sokol, primarily in the late 19th and 20th century, with its extensions in Yugoslavia, and actually now in the 21st century in North Korea, which is a sort of bastion of mass gymnastics. It has a sort of its own version of it. But in those places, primarily it has stuck, but in other places, not so much. Even in the prime communist bastions of the Soviet Union and East Germany, gymnastics never really gained traction like it did in Czechoslovakia and indeed communist Czechoslovakia. In fact, the communists renamed Sokol after 1952. They call it the Spartakiada. So how has Sokol endured for so long? Let's go on a whistle-stop tour so we can fill in any gaps at the end. I'm very happy to receive any questions that you may have. Mass gymnastics was invented by Friedrich Ludwig Jahn in Berlin in 1810 in response to the defeat of Prussia by Napoleon in 1806. And he built gymnastic clubs called Turnvereine, and the Turnvereine were bottom-up national movements through the medium of gymnastics. The idea was this was a way of expressing oneself against tyranny, against the occupation of another foreign power. And their motto was frisch, fromm, fröhlich, frei, fit, free, cheerful and godly. Now the idea of Turnverein was transferred over the border to Prague, where in the mid-19th century there was a rise in Czech national consciousness, led by the Czech figurehead Palatsky. But there were two figures that emerged on the scene amidst this development of new national consciousness among the Czechs. One was Miroslav Tirsch, who had in fact a German surname, Tirsch, but then changed it from Tirsch, German, to Tirsch in Czech. And then also we have Jindřich Fügner, whose Christian name had been German too. So instead of being Heinrich, he changed it to Jindřich. Now both these characters were swept up in this national consciousness, much of it linguistic. It was these two who introduced the Czech gymnastics version in 1862, and then they landed upon the name Sokol in 1864. Now, just as the Turnverein had been set up to face the sort of autocratic rule of king and dukes under Napoleon and beyond that, so Sokol was really aggrieved at the absolutist regime emanating out of Vienna. Now, the name Falcon means, well, Sokol, obviously falcon, and it was a deliberate decision to take on the Habsburg eagle, as if it was some kind of ornithological rivalry going on. And the key to this movement was the desire for liberation. What could be more open, I guess, and liberating than the idea of projecting the art of bodily movement in mass formation onto the public stage? And it was Sokol which took this German idea on and really made it its own, really. The tone for Sokol was set by Tirsch and Fügner, representing slightly different ideologies. I mean, who was Tirsch? Well, he was a bit of an eclectic mix of things, really. Let's face it. He understood that the physical beauty of humankind was something that he wanted to celebrate. In Greek, it's called kalogathia, a healthy soul in a healthy mind, or mens sana in corpore sano. And he also followed the likes of Charles Darwin and also some German influences as well. For example, Johann Herder, who really believed in the expression of the cultural nation, and he really leaned upon that. And not forgetting also some other philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer, who believed in living out a life in struggle for a better thing. And then he was also influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach. And again, Feuerbach was talking about a greater force in the individual. These were the kinds of influences that Tiersch took on board. Now, most of these, of course, were German. Let's not forget that. Meanwhile, Fugner believed in the emancipation of the social classes. Fugner believed in Sokol as a national movement in the widest sense, not just a kind of posse of bourgeois aesthetes. He was responsible for introducing the informal greeting T rather than V. So he would insist that men would each call each other brater or bratri, and later on, when women joined the movement, there would be sestry. So this is to break down social barriers. It was very important to do that, so that the Czech nation could really have this chance of becoming one under tyranny. The main argument in this whole presentation is that Sokol more or less stuck to this idea of democracy being open and fair, although there were several contradictions that we'll see a bit later on. Now, from Tiersch and Fugner, we may begin to understand some of the Sokol slogans that were introduced in the late 19th century and some more in the 20th century, as gymnastic clubs were established in Bohemia and Moravia. There are phrases like, every Czech a Sokol, co Czech, to Sokol, or eternal wieczny ruch, wieczny nespokojenost, eternal discontent, or co všechen lid nezná, nikdo nezná. All these kind of things. What people do not know, nobody knows. This idea that nothing's ever satisfactory. We've got to keep going and opening up. There's a sense of determination to get people motivated to believe in what was the Czech nation. Let's also realize that it wasn't just all about gymnastics. Although many people joined up in the gymnastic movement in the 1860s, by the 70s and 80s, other social events were also introduced. For example, shibrinki, which were bulls or masked bulls, if you like, introduced by Fugner. And this was a way of getting people together in Sokol halls or in village places around Bohemia and Moravia. And of course, later on as well, especially in the 1920s and 30s, we had puppet shows. So in a sense, it wasn't just a gymnastics organization, it was also very much a social, cultural organization. In any case, building gymnasiums was expensive business, and Czechs didn't really have much money to spend on these, and only by the 1890s were they really beginning to build gymnasiums to a great extent, 30 years after its establishment. And here we are, some pictures of some of the buildings that we see, that you can probably still see as you travel around every village and town today in the Czech Republic. Now, national confidence was rising, and the Sokol leadership gradually managed to extract concessions, I guess, out of the Habsburg rulers to organize big celebrations called gymnastic slety, or jamborees, if you like. Slety means, well, flights, if you like the birds in flight, collectively going together. Slet, or the slety. And these were introduced. The first one took place in 1882 on the little island in the middle of Prague, Střelecký ostrov, which is just at the bottom there on the river. That was where the first one took place, where Sokol representatives from Bohemia congregated. So this was 20 years, remember, after the establishment. It then moved to Letná Stadium, which again, there's a map up there, is north of the Vltava River, and the grounds are more extensive. As you can see, quite a few spectators could fit into the grounds there. We're talking, 100, 200,000 potentially, all meeting, congregating on that plain, the Letna plain. And then later on, because it wasn't big enough, they decided to move to Strahov, which is not far from Hrad, in another part of Prague. And again, a massive stadium that could fit hundreds of thousands. I don't know whether the figure 250, 300,000 is a plausible figure, but it was probably, and is still probably, the biggest stadium in the world that has been. And it was a massive area. I don't know how many football pitches you could fit in to that. It's still standing, by the way, but I think they're going to put something else here, technological centre. It's sort of had its day, although I just managed to visit it last year, so got there in time. So these sleti, these 6 yearly events, if you like, they required meticulous planning, huge logistical challenges in getting Sokol members from villages and towns and cities all over from Bohemia, Moravia, and later on the Slav world. And if there was anything to connect Czechs, it was surely this. Legend had it that many Czechs got married after sleti because it's one way of getting to get to know people outside your village. It was a very big social occasion. The other main consideration is that this wasn't just a Czech development. It was also exported, if you like, to other places around Europe, in Central Europe. Allegedly, the Sokol flag with a falcon on it was based on a vague Slav idea of life after death. And indeed, the whole uniform was based on apparently different parts of clothing according to where they came from. For example, the Montenegrin hat was on top, and then you had a Russian linen vest, and then Croatian. So what I'm saying, the whole idea of the uniform was based on a shared Slovak idea. Now, we talk about Tyrš and Fugner, but of course there was also the third important personality who didn't emerge in the 1860s, but emerged much later in the 1890s and beyond. And Josef Scheiner was very important, actually. He wasn't a founding father, but he was the dynamic driver of the movement from the 1890s onwards, all the way till his death in 1932. So we talk about Tyrš and Fugner, or people hear about it, but really it should be Tyrš, Fugner and Scheiner. Now, Scheiner advanced a kind of quite bold, perhaps even political thing called a neo-Slav policy designed to cooperate with all Slav nations, including Russia, thereby challenging the dominance of the Austro-Hungarian idea. And it was a bit risky, I have to say. The Slav theme came through, in fact, and many artists, Czech artists, came along and produced work to further the cause, including Alphonse Mucha. Here we are, the two posters. One was the 1912 slet, and then 1926. And there were other artists as well who joined the whole movement. Max Schwabinski, for example, or Josef Lada, the cartoonist. I mean, he also produced artwork for Sokol. They all went for it, really, and not just them, musicians as well. Leos Janáček, the musician, who at his wedding wore a little Sokol badge and even produced the Sinfonietta for the 1926 slet, and Josef Suk and others as well. So that was a big development. As I said, it's not just gymnastics, it's also cultural, very much so in the widest sense that Sokol managed to develop. By 1914, Sokol had a membership of 128,000. And the First World War, as suggested at the beginning of this talk, saw a shutting down of Sokol. at least reducing it to an underground movement. Joseph Scheiner was imprisoned, but the good news, given that the Allies had won the war in 1918, was that the Sokol was extremely well placed. Czech communities living in the United States, which had its own Sokol branches from very early on, from the 1860s, and Sokol members fighting in the legions in various places, France, Italy, but also in Russia, were huge assets and bargaining chips for the would-be leader of a new Czechoslovak nation, for Masaryk. There were huge bargaining chips for him in being able to negotiate with the great powers. Here's a picture of one Czech legionnaire, his artwork anyway, Václav Dauda, and his chess pieces that he made for a compatriot of his near Lake Baikal, and for his friend, the chess champion, Karel Hromadka. Unfortunately, Dauda died, but Hromadka survived and lived to see the birth of the new Czechoslovak state. So there was real passion, actually, behind the Sokol idea in places far as Omsk and Lake Baikal, when the Czech legions were fighting there against the Bolsheviks. It was said that even Masaryk valued Sokol. He said, without Sokol, there would have been no legion, and without the legion, there would have been no Czechoslovakia. Bez Sokola nebylo legii, bez legii by nebylo Československa. Once Czechoslovak independence had been proclaimed in October 1918, there was a vacuum in which defeated Habsburg armies, including Czechs, were either stranded abroad or slowly returning home, and someone had to restore law and order on the streets. There was literally a vacuum. So remember, this new Czechoslovak state included Bohemia, Moravia, a bit of Silesia, Slovakia and Ruthenia, and someone had to secure the borders of the new state. There was really no other alternative than to use the discipline of Sokol members to secure various parts of the territory. Josef Scheiner, the Sokol leader, was in fact made administrator of the Czechoslovak army as an interim measure, would you believe? And Sokol branches took it upon themselves to ensure that workers' strikes were reduced to a minimum and that they would also play host to returning Czech army officers coming from abroad from war. Sokol units were also dispatched to Slovakia to secure the new territory of Czechoslovakia in 1918 and also to prevent the incursion of the Hungarian communists at the bottom of the picture coming up because they were threatening, they wanted to take back Slovak territory that had been theirs for hundreds of years. So again, Sokol had a military purpose down there. After the First World War, the Czechoslovak state had its borders confirmed at Versailles. Sokol had surely to reweigh what it stood for. I mean, surely its purpose had been achieved. Czechoslovak independence, what was the point of having a Czech national movement anymore when they had received what they were aiming for 50, 60 years? But no, the story would continue. Sokol was also the most organised civic movement upon which to articulate a sense of national identity. And here we have the first slet. It didn't take them very long to organise it, but they had a bit of help from the government. The first slet after the First World War that took place. And, you know, it was a great display of national pride and jubilation. And there you have a kind of would-be Statue of Liberty that suggests that there was a new beginning. Sokol though, had to decide which way it would go. What was its ideology now that independence had been achieved? And the decision was taken that it should follow in the footsteps of the new president, Tomáš Masaryk. So it really became aligned and loyal to the new president. Well, what did this mean? This meant that actually Sokol had to be quite moderate and non-partisan and above politics where possible. It's always going to be very difficult to achieve, but more or less it tried to do this for its 20 years in the interwar period. To some extent, this was put into writing in 1924 at the Valny Zjezd. They're kind of getting together at the highest echelon of Sokol, and basically they rejected communist and radical Catholic ideology. Democracy was also upheld. This idea of the sense of gradualism and stability was seen as being very important, and terms like love for country were endorsed, and cooperation with other Slav states as well, and also a commitment to a fairer society. Now, the extent to which this was put into action is subject for discussion. Sokol also had to deal with a fascist threat. Now remember, when you look at those images of people marching around, you might get the idea perhaps there is a little bit of a tenet of fascism here. In fact, there was one political commentator, politician called Karel Kramaj, who in the 1920s tried to associate Sokol with fascism, saying that it could actually become a more beautiful version of it. And Sokol leadership the next day were on it and rejected this insinuation. They were always on the lookout for fascist people trying to disrupt Sokol activities. And you may know the fascist politician Gaidar, well, not politician, but troublemaker Gaidar, who tried to disrupt Sokol activity in 1926. All fascists were barred from Sokol after that date. Now, many argue that Sokol was never going to be perfectly tolerant. I mean, after all, it was a Czech patriotic organization, and one of its policies earlier on was to raise national identity, to reverse the consequences of hundreds of years of Magyarization and Germanization. Maybe they were euphoric in 1918 to 20 about this. Perhaps they overspelt their intentions. We have to realize that whereas the Czechs represented some 65% of Bohemia and Moravia before 1914, the paradox is that after 1918, the Czechs only represented 50% of their new territory. So there was a sense, perhaps, they had, in their eyes, more work to do. In other words, there were as many Sudeten Germans and Slovaks as there were Czechs in the interwar period. So how was Sokol going to deal with this? How would these other ethnicities, the Sudeten Germans living on the edge of the borders of Bohemia and Moravia to the left of the country there, and then the Slovaks to the east, and then Ruthenians in the far east. How are they going to, how are they going to deal with this? It was assumed in some circles that Slovaks could be incorporated into a kind of Czech-led Czechoslovak culture. Now, Sokol did not advocate a harsh policy of retribution against Sudeten Germans in the new Czechoslovakia. There is at least no solid archival material for this. They weren't necessarily implicated in some of the riots. And in many ways, their approach was to protect the state rather than to try and divide it. After all, this is what Masaryk required. He wanted the stability of the state at all costs, because after all, he had to prove that the thing would work. However, there are suggestions of rogue elements in Sokol, perhaps during those euphoric days in 1918, 1919, that were perhaps out of order. And there were occasional scuffles with the competitive Turnverein, the Sudeten German slet, if you like, the Turnfest that took place in some of those areas on the contours of West Bohemia, North, South and West Bohemia. Generally, though, Sokol was more in line with Masaryk's policy of a new civic nationalism. They were there to endorse Sudeten German activism, which was all about encouraging ethnic Germans to join the Czechoslovak state. Sokol appears in general to have done little to threaten the local Turnvereine over the 20 years, although there was the odd scuffle, as I said. In fact, Sokol sent observers to some of these events, just to take note of what they were doing, and likewise it was the other way around. But only towards the end of the 1930s, tensions rose again, and there was a little bit more rivalry, and the language got a bit more heated, and I guess Sokol was not in its best place. Not forgetting too that Henlein was the gymnastics leader himself, so that didn't help things either. A similar difficulty would apply to Slovakia. Sokol headquarters struggled to establish itself there, despite its aim of Sokol branches everywhere. And it only gained 32,000 members in the interwar period. Compare that with 500,000 signing up in Bohemia and Moravia. And that 500,000 would grow to 900,000 by 1938. So it didn't really settle or establish itself in Slovakia despite its attempts. In fact, what it seemed to do had the reverse effect, because there was also the Catholic gymnastic organization called Orel that developed, or Eagle. So it was very much in competition with the Catholic gymnastic movement. You could argue that Sokol had this sort of vague association with some Hussite imagery, trying to reinforce medieval religious figure in its national identity, and this was pursued for a few years in the 1920s. Well, Sokol membership went up and up. While Sokol lost the support of most Slovaks, it continued to gain the support of other Slavs and Serbs and Croats, and in 1926, the Sokol chair, Josef Scheiner, used the term Golden Slavic Prague, and the term Cočech to Sokol could be interchangeably used with Co Slovan je Sokol. In 1932, Slav military representations from the Little Entente, a short-lived European military alliance, were also seen parading at the slet, and there was the foreign minister, Edvard Beneš, looking on. Whatever developments were taking place around the organization, Sokol membership just kept going up and up. 500,000 in 1918 to nearly 900,000 in 1938. And that was almost 1 in 7 Czechs. Let's not forget either that it also spawned other gymnastics organizations, because Sokol was so successful. You didn't just have the Orel, you also had a workers' gymnastics movement and also a proletarian gymnastics movement. Now, if you add all those up, we're probably talking 2 to 3 out of 7 Czechs belonging to gymnastic organizations. Its jamborees, its sletty got bigger and bigger, and the whole of Prague came to a grinding halt whenever these took place. Sokol's organization was second to none, with its very strong layered organization, because it was structured like this. You had jednoty, or units in the villages and towns, and then regional levels, župy, and then at the center, you had Československá obec Sokolská in Prague. So discipline wasn't just part of the identity of gymnastics movements, it was also part of the tightly knit organization that was established. The Second World War also intervened, and once again, Sokol fell quite quickly. after it was banned by the Nazis in 1941. The underground movement, Yindra, was largely a Sokol venture, actually, and it had a role to play. It had a role to play hiding British-trained Czech parachutists, Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík of legend, who were tasked with assassinating the Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. And just as Lidice proved to be the random punishment for Czechs in this assassination, another village, Ležáky, was Sokol punishment for its hiding of radio transmitters there. The film that has come out recently, Anthropoid, Operation Anthropoid, starring Toby Jones, I think, and Cillian Murphy. Well, many of those characters are based on true Sokol personalities who helped the two parachutists come into the country and to carry out their task. Ladislav Vaniek, Jan Zelenka, Jaroslav Písnaček, the Moravec family, they all had a hand in this quite audacious assassination. By the way, it was successful for those who don't know. Heydrich was killed, but it was questionable whether this was good for Czechs or not good, but it did a bit of moral raising for a little while in any case. Sokol was war-weary in 1945, not only with its leadership in tatters, but also Sokol members had just come off the barricades in the last battle against Nazi forces. We don't know exactly, well, we do know, I think, how many Sokol members were killed in concentration camps. I think possibly 4,000. So, you know, they were really seen as a threat to the Nazis while they were in power. And so they were found out and taken to various concentration camps. Now, in 1945, they have a change of scene, of course, in terms of the ethnic makeup of Czechoslovakia, because the Sudeten Germans had to be transferred out of Czechoslovakia. So Germans no longer lived in the country. Well, what Sokol faced next was, well, what do we do now? Do we continue as an organization? And the decision was taken to continue. And its new challenge was to face the communist regime. The communists used salami tactics to try and infiltrate Sokol early in 1945. But Sokol was organized enough to see the threat and decided to go independent, despite being asked to join with other gymnastics organizations that the communists felt that it could control as a whole. Sokol went independent and managed to keep that way, actually, until 1948. So Sokol was a hard nut for the communists to crack, actually, despite other organizations, cultural organizations, and other political parties that communists were successful in infiltrating and dismantling, if you like. But Sokol was not the case, at least not until 1948. In fact, in many ways, it got stronger, because by 1948, there were 1 million members of Sokol. Despite the communist putsch of February 1948, Sokol still appeared to challenge the communist authorities. So in the 1948 Slet, it did take place after February, because the Slet took place in June and July. And at the Slet procession in Prague, what you had after and before the gymnastics displays themselves were these processions through Prague, along the cobbled streets and down Václavské náměstí, Wenceslas Square. Hundreds and hundreds of Sokol gymnastics would parade down, and there would be a presidential tribune at the bottom there in the old town. And, well, Sokol members were supposed to greet and salute, in a way, the president, or Gottwald, who was the communist president, and many of them didn't. As they walked past, they just turned away. Okay, they just turned away, and they shouted slogans like "Long live Beneš," "Ať je žije Beneš," because they were so anti-communist. Unfortunately, despite the heckling and the slogans, the communists were already really in power in every other part of society. So Sokol unfortunately came to an end not long after that. The communists closed Sokol down in 1952, but they couldn't eradicate the concept. So successful was Sokol in national development that the communists decided to continue with it, but call it something else. The communists, in fact, continued with it. They had sletties every 5 years rather than every 6 years, and renamed Sokol Spartakiada. And they had lots of Spartakiadi between 1955 and 1990. The communists took advantage. They used it as propaganda. And in a sense, it was quite effective at the beginning because, well, look at what communism is all about, the idea of masses coming together, all in accordance with one vision. So this massive moving human cogs as if the exercises at Strahov were like a production line. So in a sense, it did fit. And also there was a greater use of military drills in the 1960s, 1970s, when the communists organized their sletty. In 1968, during the Prague Spring, well, there was a window of opportunity. Well, maybe it was an opportunity, maybe it was a false dawn. But there was a resurrection of Sokol, and they began to get excited. Perhaps this was time to resurrect Sokol. It would come back up to the surface. But no, August 1968, when the Soviet tanks rolled in, Sokol saw its brief opportunity dashed. So cagey were the communists in their fear of Sokol revival that in fact they didn't go ahead with the scheduled Spartakiada of 1970, 2 years after 1968, and on schedule, if you like, 5 years after 1965. In fact, the Communist Party could only manage a Warsaw Pact gymnastic display in 1973. So it shows you that they were living in fear, actually, of Sokol members causing agitation from below. Well, after that, 1975, 1980 and 1985, you had further Spartakiadi. And during these slets, themes converged, not so much about socialist realism anymore, but more about more restrained values of family life and balance of gender. And this was, well, what could we say? Not sort of hard-hitting communist ideology, no more, but sort of Sokol normalization style. It was better for the communists to keep the Spartakiadi going as a form of societal control, but really it lost its vigor in propaganda terms. The Spartakiadi became one big pretending exercise, if you like. They pretend to control us, and we pretend to conform in bodily mass. Now, just when it might have been the case to shut down Sokol after the 1989 revolution, hadn't everyone had enough of the communist manipulation of mass gymnastics? Well, surely it's had its day 40 years later. Well, no, Sokol didn't disappear, but stayed on. Once again, like it had in 1919, like it had in 1945, it happened once again. And one Sokol writer, František Kozik, who had supported the Spartakiadi from the 1950s and to the 80s, seemed to reflect on Sokol as a kind of undying element in the tapestry of Czech life. After all, it had been going for 120 years, on and off. And although he was a communist but no Marxist, he thought that it was something that couldn't be removed. It was part of the continuing Czech story. However, it was not easy to resurrect Sokol in effective terms. It had to go through a process of restitution to claim back all the property that had been stolen by the communists. Remember, they had buildings everywhere in almost every village and town, and claiming those back would take years. However, there were some surviving members who had participated in the 1948 slet, was still alive in 1990, and they kept the thing going, really. By 1994, a new slet was established, organised at the Strahov Stadium to meet President Václav Havel. There he is. Not many attended, actually. As I said, it was early days. What was Sokol going to do? Nonetheless, Sokol has since crept back into the limelight, if you like. I think, gradually a little bit more. Now, I don't know whether there's a healthy sign that national movement devised in the 19th century, but battling out in the 20th century, can survive and repurpose itself in the postmodern age. Sokol began to recognize the idea that getting fit in the modern age was something it could easily latch onto. So Sokol gyms were established in 1996. There are also running races across the country, park runs, if you like, park runs, Czech style, and all sorts of other initiatives at at societal level to encourage fitness and a sense of belonging. Sokol also is a platform for Olympic success, and many Sokol members participate in the run-up to the Olympics. It's also introduced at kindergarten level now, encouraging exercise from an early age. That's great news, really, because what's happening is that young people will probably see the value of it, and who knows in years to come whether they will continue and then nurture their young ones to become part of Sokol. In terms of publicity, Sokol reinforced the memory of Sokol's past heroism, including remembrance services that take place every year now on the 8th of October to remember those who fell at the hands of Nazis in 1941 and obviously to 1945. And then you have presidential flag swapping between the president and Sokol as well, that reflects the cooperation, if you like, between president and society, or at least one part of Czech society. It's an organization that is well grounded in its support. There's the latest president at the recent 2024 slet, by the way, only took place a month ago. As I said, it's got support, and there are many sponsors now who like the idea. It's Česká televize and Penny, the supermarket. You've got Česká pošta, you've got Radiožurnál Sport, you've got the Olympic Committee. They're all on board, really, to move this idea of Sokol along, to make it, I suppose, a positive thing for Czech society. So what are we to make of Sokol? First, it is an organization that has survived many, many eras. The falcon flying up and down and out. It's shown grit and determination. And in a sense, the Tyrschen adage of constant effort, Věčný ruch, still rings true. It just keeps going. Secondly, Sokol has found a niche for itself in postmodern society, despite a Western culture that is dependent on individuality and opposed to the collective. Its success has been both based on individual athletic pursuits and mass sport, encouraging people to think about their health. And health is a big thing these days. Mental health is a big thing as well. Sokol is much about well-being as it is about gymnastics. Third, Sokol has signalled to society in its recent showcasing that Sokol was generally a success story in historical terms against the topsy-turvy nature of the 20th century. After all, it wasn't absolutism or totalitarianism that ultimately came through, but democracy. Sokol was there when it mattered and played its cards right. Now, should another crisis come? Well, God forbid, Sokol might be there to help things along. So democracy is fragile and it needs protecting. And any civic organisation that stands up for moderation and democracy is usually a useful one, especially in these very precarious times. Thank you for listening to a whistle-stop tour of Sokol. Probably lots of gaps in there, but I'm quite happy to take any questions or share anything that you may have from your experiences of Sokol life.
I'm sure you all agree with me that that was an absolutely brilliant talk. I'm sure we've all learnt a great deal, even those who are familiar with the Sokol movement as such. And you've not only given us such a comprehensive talk, but you've touched upon so many issues that are related to it. And I don't think we could hope for more. If I may, I'd like to add a small anecdote. In my own studies, I interviewed an English lady who was in the Sokol during the war. She had joined the YWCA, the Young Christian Women's Movement. And nearby, they had a gym, she was involved. And the men serving in the army needed some women. So they went along to this YWCA and asked if anybody would like to join their Sokol group. So they participated in the demonstrations, they learnt some of the Czech and Slovak folk dances, and they were so proud to wear their Sokol uniform. And even when the lady was relating this to me, she was so proud and remembered Gabčík practicing and stretching and exercising in the background. And then after the dreadful event in Prague, they all realized that he wasn't coming back. And the sadness, especially of those close to him. And she said she could never forget that. But the whole experience of being involved in the Sokol movement left her with tremendous memories. And I have photographs and copies of the programs as well. And Masaryk and Benish, they attended a number of those events. So I think now, if I may ask, as I'm here, the first question, when were women involved? And this whole talk seems so appropriate, given that some of us, including Michal Sokol, were at Brookwood Cemetery in the military part on Sunday, remembering those who had fallen and feeling for those who have survived and still grieve for them. And the Sokol movement, as you've described it, the rise and the fall, and I know it's also active in Canada, is hopeful. And the aims, the objectives, the feeling for others, and what it teaches us, I think, is relevant for any age. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll answer the question you asked. Thank you very much for the anecdote. And I'm sure there are other anecdotes here.
I'm sure there are.
Going back within the families of Czech generations. The woman question, well, it was in the early 1890s that a Sokol branch of women was established. And by 1907, they were actually participating at the Slet. And it was quite a wow factor, actually, in 1907. We have to go back to those days. I mean, you remember emancipation. I remember generally speaking, it was early days for women. But in many ways...
And the costumes also, I mean...
Yeah. Yes, exactly, the costumes, the artwork that went into the costumes. But I think they were a tour de force at the 1907 Slet because they didn't just do exercises, they used these, is it kuzhinki, the pins, dancing with these sort of pins rather than dancing, and it was a wow factor at 1907. And then they never looked back, really.
No.
During the 1920s and 30s, and even in the 40s and 50s, various very well-known Sokol members like Milada Mala and Maria Provaznikova, who, you know, were determined to give the men a run for the money, if you like, in the organization. And she may well have ended up, you know, if in the late 1940s as the head. She was very much listened to. In fact, during the late 1940s, she disagreed with Sokol, Starosta Hřebík, about his sort of soft approach to the communists, and was just determined to say, no, we are independent. We're not going to let our guard down. We will keep the Sokol flag flying. Of course, we know Maria Praviznokova came back here to London and then emigrated to the United States, where she continued doing excellent gymnastic work for Sokol, all the way through, I think, to early 1990s. So, yes, women were a very important part. Of course, raising the numbers of members in Sokol, but also encouraging children to join. So you have the dorostva and also the žáctvo, you know, the youth and the pupils. So bringing women involved obviously helped the whole family cause becoming part of Sokol.
And the whole upbringing.
Yeah.
Yes. Are there any questions, please? And I'm sure that there are some of you here to whom I've spoken earlier on who would like to contribute as well. Your own observations, your own experiences, or those of your parents.
Can I ask, who was the first time? Helena Zvojsíková. It's not really a question. I would like to issue a plea for the Czech Republic not being called Eastern Europe. The Czechs don't like it, and the Austrian protest because Vienna is even further east, and they are not considered themselves Eastern. Going back to the Spartakiada, the name of Sokol disappeared after the communist takeover and never reappeared until communism left Czechoslovakia. Spartakiada was the once in 5 years sporting event. And as a school child, we hated the year before because all our PE lessons had to be spent by preparing for the event, which was really awful. Because there was for the whole year, our 2 periods a week of PE, there was nothing else but preparing the performance. The names vanished, although the Czechs always, even under communism, called the buildings where the gyms were Sokolovna. Mm-hmm. But the actual organizations had a terrible name called TJ and a name. The TJ stood for Tělovýchovná jednota and the name of the place. But everyone under communism always went to do exercises in Sokolovna.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But did you object because of the amount of physical exercise, or on principle because of the communists? Because it was a communist event?
When you were 7, 8, 9, you didn't care for communism. You wanted to have games, you wanted to have runs, and instead you were kept in the gym doing, gymnastics every time there was a PE period.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insight there, for real life situation those decades ago is much appreciated. I don't know what your view is of Sokol these days, in the modern age. Does it have a place in society? I suppose it's just a question for anybody here. I mean, it keeps going, it seems to have some good support. Is it a good thing, actually, in this era to have something like this, which is, well, I mean, let's face it, doesn't happen everywhere. There's a tradition and a heritage upon which it's built. It seems to be a good thing. It's a civic organization. And I know that half of the membership of the 180,000 Sokol members are under 18. Yeah, at the moment. So, you know, does that bode well for Sokol as young people get active? You know, they like the outdoors, but they're perhaps not so much on their mobile phones and tablets. You know, that is that sort of idea, I think, to open people out to sporting activity in nature.
Yes, I have been a Sokolka for my whole life, really. And when this is a little anecdote that I'm going to say. When I joined Sokol London about 25 years ago, I was introduced to Slečna Pokorna, who at that time was 100 years old. She was in a concentration camp, and she survived that famous March of Death. And when I asked her, of course I was curious, what is the secret of her long life? She said to me that the secret of long life for her was that she never got married and that she was a Sokolka. Which one was better? So anyway, it's just a little anecdote. I have actually been participant of two sleds in 2000, I think around 2000, and then the next one, my husband marched with me in a procession representing Sokol London. It was very emotional for us, wasn't it? Yeah, anyway, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Well, it's wonderful to hear your experiences as well. Maybe have a chat after about them to find out more. It's absolutely wonderful. Are there any other Sokol members here out of interest? Or not sure.
Thank you for presenting Sokol from the other side, which most people don't know, which is the political aspect, an aspect of Czechoslovak nationalism and being part of Czechoslovak society. And please, on behalf of Sokol London, could I present you with a small memento, which is a Sokol tie, if you have one.
Well, this is absolutely marvelous. I don't have one of these, so thank you so much. Yeah. Good.
I'm afraid that the tie was not made in Prague, but it was made in London.
Yes.
Wow. And it was made for the members of the ex-Czechoslovak military servicemen, and in fact that is very dear to us because it's fairly old, you see.
Yeah.
And I had a full box of them.
Yeah. Well,
I think all of us like one. I'll be first one.
Yeah, good, absolutely terrific. Thank you ever so much. Yeah, and I always, you know, the logo is also amazing, isn't it? The logo,
Yes.
which was quite advanced for its age in the late 19th century, you know, and it still looks very good on the website. You know, Česká Sokolska. So that thank you so much indeed. Really a real surprise and delight.
We have not mentioned here that Sokol was surviving as an independent entity during communism. Yeah. That we, London, Paris, Swiss people, Sweden, Italy, you name them, Americans, were holding Sokolsky sleds, Zurich, Paris, abroad. So we carried out the tradition despite whatever was happening without the Iron Curtain.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, the Sokol found another place to continue. It flew off and migrated, and you know, for a while, and that's what was so important. Yeah.
And Sokol London had a good name, and was established with the Czechoslovak government in exile, in as much that it was considered part of freedom and resistance against the Nazi oppression. Indeed, Sokol owns part of Czechoslovak National House and in London, and the fact that President Beresh contributed certain amount of money and put together all the remaining Czechoslovak British Legion, Czechoslovak section British Legion, Sokol, and Czechoslovak Colony Club, established 1904. So that was, I should say, quite an potent nationalistic or nationalist Czechoslovak force, which carried the free spirit abroad. As you know, theatres, trips abroad, trips.
That's tremendous.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much indeed. It's a real pleasure to meet you on this day.
I'm lost for speech actually.
No, I'm lost for words for this. So thank you ever so much. Yeah, it really is. Thank you so much.
Your contribution is wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say what was written here?
And they will speak.
Just from the Zoom, from the audience there, it's they just added the Spartakiada, that was compulsory. Obviously, the sled was more voluntary, and otherwise they just saying brilliant talk, loving it. Thank you so much, enjoyable and very informative. Thank you to the speakers and organizers. So just from that, thank you very much for all the people on Zoom.
Are there any more contributions, please, or anything that someone would like to say before we end?
Yeah, can I? Oh. It's not actually a question. I live in Brezno, it's in the middle of Slovakia, and usually we naming a gym like Telocvičňa, but there we don't name it one place, we call that Sokolovňa. So imagine after I don't know how many years, we still don't say Telocvičňa but Sokolovňa because it stick with that name in our city. So I was a bit surprised, like not many Slovakian people actually joined the Sokol movement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more contributions, may I thank you very much indeed for this absolutely brilliant presentation, which I think will give us much to think about in terms of attitudes, beliefs, and objectives. And perhaps some people will be moved to join Sokol, or the members of their families, perhaps. But it's been very appropriate because Czech National Day was on the 28th, which people celebrated, and it is a reminder, though we may feel far away at times, we're still very close to it. Thank you all very much for coming. If I may detain you from the refreshments for just another moment, I'd like to tell you about our annual dinner on the 22nd of November, Friday the 22nd of November. And it's a joint event, BCSA and the Czech-British Chamber of Commerce at the Mayfair Hotel just by Green Park. Good food, good company of course, and some very interesting presentations. And it's not too late to register and to attend. So we hope you all feel very welcome to come along too. And now I think for our own refreshments, sustenance, thank you very much indeed for coming, and it's been a pleasure to welcome you all. And thank you to you, Michal especially, and to our speaker. It's been really, really special. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, can't switch it off.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's off. Manage. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that last bit insight. Yeah, it was interesting,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, because you said like not many Slovakian people.
Yeah.
actually, but I'm from the city where was the gym named Sokolovnia. So we
Yeah.
don't call that gym. We say that's Sokolovnia.
Yeah.
Like those.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
With the politics taken out now, you know.
I'd like to take a picture with the
Oh.
Yeah.
Can you just stand over there?
Yeah.
Maybe here somewhere, like here.
Yeah.
Please do
Yeah.
stay and have some
Yeah,
wine.
Something like this,
and
is
some,
it?
and
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
continental biscuits.
Michal, would you like to take a picture too? Yeah.
Yes, do.
Okay. I know
You
better
come
is
in.
here. Just come over here. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, I see, thorn between two roses.
Yeah.
Oh, please come.
Oh, yeah, thank you to protect
Please
it.
come and
That's
join the
wonderful.
photograph.
Yeah. I'll put it in there. Yeah.
I can't be honored with that degree when I.
Yanni. Is it okay?
Yeah, it's good. We've got a professional